Okay, so today we're on lesson 2.3, which is all about weathering and erosion. And what those two things are the breakdown of the Earth's crust in some way or another. So generally we break it into two categories, physical or chemical weathering. And what physical means is you're literally breaking physical pieces off of those rocks. So taking a large boulder and breaking it down into pieces like pea gravel or just smaller rocks you'd run into on the road or anywhere else. What chemical weathering is going to be the breakdown of those rocks through a change in how they're organized and how they're composed on a smaller level. So when we see acid rain or we see rust, that's going to be a chemical breakdown or chemical weathering and erosion. But when we see that we throw a rock over across the pond or at a tree and that tree breaks or that rock breaks, that's actually going to be our physical weathering or erosion. Now, some examples of physical weathering that we're going to see is something called frost wedging, which means you take a rock that has cracks in it, and in those cracks, water is going to seep. It's going to freeze, and when water freezes, it gets bigger. So when it expands, it'll break the rock more. Again, that's called frost wedging. Another example is going to be when water continuously runs over a surface. As you see, it'll carry sand, it moves sand on the beach, but when water runs over rocks for a long period of time, it also breaks them down. So running water is also a form of physical weathering. And the last is when animals create their homes, they burrow. So they break through the rocks, they break through the Earth's crust and build their homes like that. As I mentioned, rust is a very good example of chemical weathering, and acid rain. So acid rain is what happens when we have pollution in the air. It gets in the water before it rains, and it rains down and causes the breakdown. Now this is important because it helps shape not only the state of North Carolina, but it also helps shape the rest of the world. So we talked last time about how different boundaries can create different forms of land. One of those was mountains, like the Blue Ridge Mountains that we have in Asheville. What happens is that over time, as our mountains were formed, they're slowly going to get broken down and down and down. So if you look at North Carolina, you'll see that the mountains are going to be the highest, and they slowly slope down and flatten out as we get closer to the beach near Wilmington. So what we see is that mountains, through wind and water running against them, will first turn into plateaus, then plains, and then coastal regions or coastal plains. So over time, as you continue to add that force, that pressure, it's going to break down the mountains through physical and chemical weathering to form plateaus, so flatter regions that are elevated, and then plains. What's important about all of this is also what keeps it from working or what makes it speed up faster. So if we look at the climate of an area, so the general weather patterns over time, warm and wet areas are going to favor chemical weathering, while cold and wet are going to favor physical weathering. Now the reason this makes sense is that chemical reactions happen easier when there's more energy. So you have to put in less energy for them to happen. That's going to be in a warm environment, just like the sun provides us the energy to move, to work around, and the energy for movement in the earth. That same heat is going to power the chemical reactions that allow for chemical breakdown. On the other hand, if you've ever made something cold, it's more bitter, it's more brittle, it's easier to break. So physical weathering is more likely to happen in a cold and wet environment. The reason that water is present in both is because it weakens the stability of something. It weakens that area just like water running over a mountain or water running over rocks. The second thing that will provide how quickly or how slowly that our weathering or erosion will happen is the type of rock. So the harder, denser rocks, so our metamorphic rocks and some of our igneous rocks, are going to break down slower. But our sedimentary rocks, the ones that have a bunch of pieces and chunks pieced together, are going to break apart easier. They're made of different pieces. Metamorphic rocks are one solid hunk, so they're going to be harder to break apart. And igneous rocks do have some gaps in them from gas flowing out when they cooled, but they too are going to take a little bit longer to break down. The last idea is how much surface area is present. So what that means is the more exposure something has to the wind, to the water, to the air, the faster it's going to break down. So if you think about it, if you're out and it's a windy day, the more spread out that you are, the more wind that you're going to feel. But if you curl up, the less wind you're going to feel. So our erosion acts the same way. The more spread out you are, the more the wind can hit you, the more you're going to break down. And the more curled up you are, so less surface area, the less you're going to break down. A few other things to consider is how much stuff's in the way. So if we have plants or trees or vegetation, grass, flowers, anything, that's going to block the wind or the water from hitting the mountains or the area. So trees, plants say bow down to the wind and to water.